going to begin my sermon with a bit of a disclaimer. I really don't watch hardly any TV at all. I mean, almost none. And that's important for you to know as I make my next point. Because a few months back, I was going through my Facebook feed, and all of a sudden, I started seeing folks writing a very interesting phrase. Dilly, dilly. I was like, what is this? The Houston Astros win the World Series, dilly, dilly. Jose Altuve wins the MVP, dilly, dilly. I'm like, what in the world is going on? And I'm too embarrassed to ask, all right? I don't want to get in one of them Facebook fights, so I just kind of let it go. Well, a couple weeks ago, I'm visiting an internet site that I enjoy reading called Intellectual Takeout. And I finally found out what Dilly Dilly was all about. Don't worry, it's empty. And I poured it out for the birds to enjoy. Maybe. But there was a headline on this blog, and it said, Bud Light's Dilly Dilly commercial is ingenious. And so I was like, wow, this is interesting. Okay, now I finally am putting a thing together with Dilly Dilly because I don't watch TV. So it's a commercial. And fortunately for me, on that website, there was a link to the YouTube station showing me the commercial. So I finally got to see it. Now, how many of you have seen Bud Light's Dilly Dilly commercial? Show of hands real quick. Some of you. Okay, great. I'm glad some of you have. But for those of you who are like me and had absolutely no clue, let me run through it for you just a little bit. You see, the commercial begins in a medieval castle. And there's a banquet going on. And there are people coming up to give homage to the king and bring him gifts. And the first person goes up and puts a 6-pack of Bud Light in front of the king. And the king says, Sir Jeremy, you are a true friend of the crown, picks up his bottle and says, Dilly Dilly. And everybody else in the banquet hall picks up their bottle of beer and says, Dilly Dilly. Some of you know it. The next person in line is a lady who has a 20-pack of Bud Light. She places it in front of the king, and the king says, Lady Susan, you are an even truer friend of the crown. Dilly Dilly. And everybody says, Dilly Dilly. Then the next guy in line is a very different character. He's kind of these interesting people. And he comes up, and he puts this green bottle with this kind of homemade cap on top. And the music stops. And the king looks at him and says, what is this? And the guy is with kind of great flair. He looks at the king and says, this is this spiced honey mead wine that I have really been into lately. And he kind of grins at the king and says, so, Dilly Dilly? And the king says, Sir, let me introduce you to Sir Brad, who is going to give you a tour of the pit of misery. And the guy goes, say what? And before anything else can go transpire, one of the party guests raises his bottle of Bud Light and says, pit of misery, Dilly Dilly. And everybody else says, Dilly Dilly. And then it cuts away and it shows the advertisement for Bud Light at that time. Now, somebody's phones are going off like mine is, probably Amber Alert or something like that. I can hear it happening. We'll pray for the persons who are under that alert. Anyways, we will continue. Now, you may be wondering, what in the world does this commercial for Bud Light have to do with the birth of Jesus Christ? I mean, it seems like the two are kind of polar opposite. They're miles and miles apart. I mean, we know that Jesus is the light of the world, but that doesn't quite qualify for Bud Light, does it? So what does the two have to do together? Well, let me read to you really quickly a couple of paragraphs from this blog of how this person ties some things together and what he says is going on in this commercial. The writer writes this, when I first saw this commercial, I laughed so hard to the point of nearly crying. This one ad brilliantly calls out the snobbery of craft brew culture and all the pomp that goes with it. Nowhere does it make a direct pitch for Bud Light. It just says exactly what we think but never say. Bud Light's a people's beer. And that's just fine because now the people rule. So embedded in this commercial is a bit of the story that no longer would the elite of the past determine the taste of the kingdom and the way resources would be used. There would be mass production for the masses of people. It was a revolution in history and one that would never stop. And from a marketing point of view, this commercial deals directly with Bud Light's real competition in the craft brew industry, which is making inroads by the day. Now, Bud Light obviously cannot claim to have a better product. And guess what? Everyone knows that. Everyone knows what a Bud Light is. It's a beer-like drink that is watery, but lets you drink a six-pack in an evening without any great disaster for the next day. Sorry, snobs, but the people like this feature. And if you are in the know, you are starting to get the sense of a whole world in which the tastes and habits of regular people have become the prevailing cultural sense. No more top-down cultural impositions. Now, my point in sharing this with you is not to encourage you to go out after worship today and drink a six-pack of Bud Light, because there will be very little repercussions tomorrow morning, all right? That's not my point at all. And my point is not even to get you to drink Bud Light. But if you are a representative of Anheuser-Busch tonight and you would like to pay me for giving you that plug right there, no, I'm just joking. That's not the point at all. The point is what the author leads us to in that last sentence. There's no more top-down cultural impositions from this elite group that is trying to tell everybody what we should and shouldn't do. Because you see, that's actually the way the world tends to work, doesn't it? If you want change in society, if you want things to move in a certain direction, what do we generally do these days? We try to elect people to Austin, to Washington, D.C., to pass the kind of laws that we want to see passed and enforce them so that this top-down imposition will affect the rest of society. That's what we tend to do. And you know what? God could have done that too. God could have used a top-down imposition to bring His rule to earth. He could have sent Jesus to a palace with a king and a queen so that He would have been raised in the lap of luxury and power, and then He would have ascended the throne. And filled with the power and wisdom of God, He could have instituted His rule. And on one hand, it would have been really, really awesome. Because with Jesus and the power and wisdom of God, no one in the kingdom would have gone hungry. If there would have been drought or famine or anything else like that, He would have produced food for all to eat. No one would have been sick. No one. He would have healed all diseases. Anything that affected anyone negatively, He would have brought healing. And no one could have stood against His might and power. If invading armies would have come in, He would have simply unleashed the power of God and defeated everyone's enemies and kept everyone safe and sound. And the kingdom would have thrived because He would have been wise, implementing the right rule. And the people would have loved Him for it. But they would have also been terrified of Him. And that might sound a little weird, but stay with me here. Because not only would He been good in instituting all of those things, but He would have had to implement justice in His kingdom. Which meant if you broke any of His laws, if you broke any of His statutes, punishment would follow, and it would be severe. Because no one would be allowed to stand against this wise God King's rule. If you stole, if you murdered, forget it. His wrath would burn hot against you. If you tried to lead a rebellion, you would have gone up in smoke. And if anyone dared would have come to subvert the kingdom, He would have unleashed His full fury upon that group of folks. And so yes, it would have been very, very good. But people would have followed his laws. They would have followed his commands out of what? Fear. And God does not want us to follow his commands out of fear. And so instead of coming to earth to a king and a queen in a royal palace, he came to earth with an ordinary man and an ordinary woman in a stable. Instead of being born and wrapped with the finest of cloths and kept warm next to a fireplace in a giant castle, he was wrapped in swaddling clothes, laid in a manger, and surrounded by hay. Instead of having royal heralds go out into the community and announce to all of the nobility that the king now has a son, it was angels on a hillside proclaiming to a group of ordinary shepherds as they were doing their ordinary jobs. God's arrival to earth was not meant to bring about fear. It was not meant to bring about terror. It was not meant to be about power and prestige. It was meant to be about humility that would cause us to wonder and marvel at what God is doing. A wonder and marvel that would begin to weasel its way into our hearts so that we may be able to see the love of God as he pours it out into the world through Jesus Christ. And that great love is not necessarily seen in his healing or his feeding of the hungry. It's not necessarily seen in his teaching and preaching. It is seen most vividly as he takes away our sin by dying for us on the cross. For we know that we don't follow the commands of God. We know that we fail to love our neighbor as ourselves. We know that we fail to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, with all of our mind, with all of our soul, with all of our strength. We know that we fail to keep God in his proper place and instead chase after false gods and idols, thinking that they will bring us safety, security, peace, and joy. And that can only be found in the one true God. As St. Paul says in the book of Romans, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We deserve his punishment. We deserve the king's wrath. But instead of receiving it, Jesus comes forth and says, no, I will take the punishment. I will take their sin upon myself. I will die for them in their place. You know, it's really not such a radical thought on one level. Because, I'm a parent. And I understand what it is for a parent to pay for the sins of their children. If you're going through the grocery store or going through Walmart, sometimes kids get a little rambunctious, right? Sometimes they break stuff. Now, what do you do as a parent? You call the store manager, hey, come here, my kid broke this. Call the cops. Send them to jail. They need to pay for their sin. They need to pay for what they have done. And that's somewhat what society says and does anyways. We all have to pay our debts to society if you break the law and what have you. But what does a good parent do? A good parent doesn't reach for the phone to call the police. He or she reaches for her wallet, his wallet, pays for the item because they love their child. And so the question then becomes, what does the child do next? Does he or she realize what their parents have done in paying for them and keeping them out of trouble? And do they then change their reckless ways, or do they continue to do the same things over and over and over again? Oh, my brothers and sisters, that's a question for us. For if we come to understand what Jesus has done for us on the cross, if we understand that we should be the ones hanging there, if we understand that he has taken our place, our hearts melt. Our hearts melt in love for the God who was willing to die for us, the God who was willing to take our place, the God who was willing to love us with an amazing love, the God who does not come to sit on a throne and lord it over us, but instead comes to be enthroned in our hearts with a love that brings us all the peace, love, joy, and hope that we could ever ask for. And that love begins to find itself and make itself manifest to us tonight in the stable in Bethlehem as we celebrate the arrival of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the one who will take sin upon himself and set us free. It's a love and a grace that is not just for the elite, but it's for all people, for king and shepherd, for rich, for poor, for Republican, for Democrat, for liberal, for conservative, for craft brew drinkers, for Bud Light drinkers. It's a love for you and for me. God's love poured into our hearts through the grace that he gives to the entire world. May you know that love. May you know that grace. May you know that peace this night and every night. And at this time, I'm really tempted to raise that bottle and say, "Dilly, dilly," one more time. But instead, I will say, "Merry Christmas. Amen."